I don't know whether you can hear me this far away from the mic, but
Go ahead.
I'll continue anyway. Um, Thanks for coming tonight. We're doing something a little bit different tonight. We're going to be recording the session so we can push it out to more people. But before we get started, I recognize, have you been before?
Yes,
Okay, I just didn't
I always
recognize
sit
you
in
for
the
the
last
last one.
row though. So
You always sit in the last row. So we don't have anyone
So
new
if you're
here.
over here, I'll sit back there, and if
Right,
you're there, I'm
right.
sitting back here. That's how I do it.
That's the deal.
So we don't have anyone new tonight. But just for the record, what are we going to do next time? Do we know yet?
That's what you and I need to
We need to
discuss.
discuss. Okay. We don't know what we're going to do a month from now yet. So if you've got ideas, let us know.
Cut the cable, the ultimate
We'll
cut.
go with, yeah, if nothing else, we'll go with cut the.
I'll bring the giant scissors.
Because there's enough. It's always changing, the market's changing, everything's different every month by the sound of it. Anyway, this month, you're gonna have to put up with me. And I plan on talking about the new MacBook. I see Mike over here has got one, and I've got one here. This is the new MacBook Air with the new M1 chip. And I wanted to give a little bit of a presentation on that. Can you bring up the presentation? Okay. Do you want us, can I operate it?
You ready?
I can operate, whoops. No, okay, there you go. I've got, a few slides, but they won't take me long to go through. They're really short. First of all, I want to go over what just happened in the last month. I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between CISC and RISC. If you don't know what it is, then hopefully you will by the end of this session. Talk a little about ARM, or ARM holdings as they are today. Talk about the performance of the M1 chip. That's basically the core of this little beast. Talk about software support for it. Talk about emulation of the old Intel x86 64-bit software. Talk about virtualization. In other words, making this look like Windows 10 or Linux. And then finally, a little bit of crystal ball gazing and see what to expect in the next 12 months or so. So first of all, what happened? What happened last month is Apple released a major change to their laptop desktop computers. This is within the lifetime of Apple. This is the second or third major change. Previous one being when they switched from the PowerBook to Intel, which was in 2012, I want to say. I don't know. And then today or last month, they changed from Intel as their main processor to their own design chip based on ARM, an ARM instruction set. Basically, what this has done is it's brought the PCs from Apple within the total Apple ecosystem. So now they're much more similar to the iPhone, iPad, iWatch, and now Mac OS is also in that same ecosystem, because whether you knew it or not, the iPad, the iPhone, and the Apple Watch are all driven by Apple designed A processors. This one's got I don't know what this one has in this, gone to the A12. The iPad, for example, is using today is using an A14, which is similar to the M1, but designed for the touchscreen. So anyway, that puts the whole thing in context.
So the chips all made in China?
No, they're made in Taiwan. They're not made in China, which is another story. And I'll cover that a bit later. We'll talk about that because that's a very important point. And it's central to what Donald Trump's been doing with China, which a lot of people don't understand. I didn't realize till I started looking into it. Okay, next. First of all, the main CPU within the I should say that the M1 chip is not a CPU. It's what's called an SoC, basically a system on a chip, rather than a processing unit alone. And if you look at the underlying picture there, you can't see it very well, but you'll see that's kind of a picture of the chip. And on the chip, there's a CPU, a GPU. There's also what they call a neural system, for want of a better word, which is basically an artificial intelligence. Part of it, there's a security chip within there. So T2 that was on the older PCs has now been rolled into the chip. So it's more than just a central processing unit. But the central processing unit, part of it, is based on ARM rather than the Intel's CISC. And what that is CISC and RISC were developed kind of in the 80s and 90s. And basically how you create the computer itself, whether you use a simple instruction set, and the original computers were based on a simple instruction set, which basically you had a box, a few boxes called registers, where you put numbers and you added them or you subtracted them. And that's kind of very simple. You got an add, subtract, and a sum, basically, and you move that to another box. And there were a very few number of instructions. But as this computers got more complex, they came up with, or Intel actually developed this set of additional instructions to do more complex tasks, so that you didn't have to do 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 to do 5 times 1. You could do 5 times 1 with one instruction. So instead of having a whole string of instructions, you only ended up with one instruction. And the box that did that had some computer power associated with it. So that became the kind of the foundation for Intel. And for what they did, they increased the number of instructions. And the Intel 8086 chip was the one that kind of started it all off and became the 286, 386, and so on. And that's where the x86 comes from. And then at some point in time, they switched from a 16-bit to a 32-bit to a 64-bit bus, and it became an x86-64, which is what the modern Intel computers are today. The other, in parallel with that, there was a small British company called ARM, originally called Acorn, and they developed a fairly sophisticated, less powerful CPU, which had more instructions. So it had fewer computations, but more instructions. And the benefit of the two of them is that the RISC processor actually produces less heat and it requires less power than the more complex CPU that Intel had developed. So because of that, RISC got picked up in the early days with the phones, originally the iPod, then the phones, and so on. And they all are based, and every phone you buy today is using a CPU, which is based on a limited, reduced instruction set as opposed to Intel's more complex one. Now, what happened along the way is that these two processes got kind of jumbled up. And what happened is Intel started to see what was happening and they started adding things to their chip. And it became more of instead of a simple computer on a chip, it became a computer plus all the bits that normally go on the motherboard appeared on the chip. And somewhere along the road, Intel produced a chip which Apple picked up on and put in their computers, which actually was a system on a chip, not just a CPU. Anyway, back to ARM. ARM is a really speckled history with ARM, although it started as a small computer company based in Cambridge in the UK. It got spun off to an investment company which included Apple, and they changed the name, or they changed it still ARM, but instead of Acorn Risk Machine, it became Advanced Risk Machine. And they changed the name and they formed a company. And I'll talk a little bit about that a bit later, through a spin-off. Was later sold to the Japanese, to another company. And I'll come back to that point because it's quite an important point for the future. The other thing that along the way upset Apple was the risk model, the business model that Intel had adopted. And they'd had troubles with the phone because actually, if you read the history, Steve Jobs had discussions with Intel way back when about developing an ARM type processor to use in a phone. And Intel took a look at it and said, "No, the market's not there. We don't want anything to do with it." So in essence, they shut down Apple. So that's when Apple first got involved with ARM. And now over the years, particularly with the development of the iPad and so on, the ARM processors got more and more complex. The system on chip that Apple used got more and more complex. And the performance got better as well. So that over time, the performance maybe 2 or 3 years ago was approaching that of Intel's CISC computer for laptops. So I think Apple decided at that point that it was time to get involved with their own design. Again, Intel were very restrictive about their CPU. You had to use Intel's CPU made by Intel. Whereas ARM business model was different in that ARM basically designed the computer like an architect, if you will, and then sold it to a builder to build it. Whereas Intel acted like the architect and the builder to build their chip. So Apple, I think at some point decided to get off that path, and they started developing their own chip. They'd already spent 10 years or so with the ARM technology. So they then moved it over to the PC. If you move to the next one. I talked a little bit about the ARM history, but one thing that's interesting that's happened more recently is that back in 2016, ARM got sold to a Japanese company called SoftBank, basically an investment company, which kind of upset the market somewhat. But last year, as recently as September last year, NVIDIA, if you're familiar with computers, NVIDIA makes a lot of graphics components. They're very big into graphics, GPUs and so on. They actually bought ARM from SoftBank for, I want to say $40 billion. I mean, they spend a lot of money, but they actually bought ARM from SoftBank. Now, I'm not sure that this is 100% consummated. It was happened last September, and right now there's a lot of, I want to say, fuss within the UK about that purchase, whether or not it actually gets consummated or not. I'm not 100% sure. I think there's a 6-month period in which the deal can be contested. So anyway, that's happening right now. Moving on. Talk about the performance of the M1 chip. The M1 chip basically outperforms all of the MacBook, the older MacBooks and the MacBook line. It outperforms the latest Intel laptops and so on. And it even outperforms what I call middle-of-the-road graphic processors. So basically desktops with an Intel chip and a graphics board. The high-end NVIDIA graphics boards still outperform the M1, but the middle-of-the-road ones do not. And these are links, excuse me, I'm gonna have to get some water, I think. If you click on these, and I'll be putting this presentation up, so you can pull it up on GPIO. If you click on the links, it'll give you a little bit more information. I don't want to go through it all right now, but if you're interested, you can see. Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks. Yeah, if you look at these articles, you can get a little bit more information about how the M1 basically outperforms. You want to go back to the presentation? Yeah, this is just typical of this is for the chart I've got on here is for the Mac, for Apple computers. But for example, the 13-inch MacBook Pro, the M1 MacBook Pro, you can see it significantly outperforms even the 16-inch MacBook Pro Core i9 from 2 years ago, which is an amazing improvement. And even the 2019 Mac Pro, which is a multi-$1,000 computer, $4,000. It outperforms that by like 70%. So that this is not a small step change. This is a huge step change in terms of performance. And again, these other links will take you if you want to know more about how that works. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of software, the software that you run on a Windows computer is basically designed using like C or something like that, a high-level computer language, which then goes through a compiler, which compiles it to machine code. Now that compiler is basically for Windows, it's an x86 compiler. So it compiles for the Intel x86 type programs. So it doesn't work with the RISC computer. You have to have a different compiler to get it to work with the RISC computer. So what Apple has done is they've converted all their native programs to work with the ARM M1 processor. So all their native programs, that's things like Mail, Notes, Messages, Final Cut Pro, QuickTime, Numbers, and their Office suite. They all work natively with the M1 processor. iMovie, all of the all of those, they all work natively. So there's no translation involved. And then they've been working over the last 12 months or so with the major software houses like Adobe, Chrome, Firefox, Microsoft, even Microsoft, to get their software natively working on the M1 processor. So programs like Lightroom, Chrome and Firefox browsers, and Microsoft 365 suite, and there's a whole bunch more, are now natively run on the M1 processor. Now, the upside of this for Microsoft is that they're very close to being able to work with Microsoft ARM processors as well. As an aside, Microsoft actually released their Surface computer, like this one here, with an ARM processor a year ago, something like a year ago. But they didn't do a very good job of working with the third-party apps. They didn't do, and I'll talk about it in a minute, they didn't do a very good job with emulation. They put in, and let me go to the next slide because I think I talk about emulation. What Rosetta does, it emulates, go back, Rosetta, right, Rosetta emulates the x64 or the x86 64 CPU on the M1. So it makes the software think it's talking to an x64 computer, an x86 computer, where it's actually talking to an M1. So it's in between the M1 chip and that software, there's an emulator, which kind of converts the machine code from x86 code to run on the ARM computer. Now, this is quite important. It's a real benefit to Apple and Microsoft when they put their Surface Pro out with the Q1, is it, or Q2? I can't remember the designation with it. It's basically, it's right. They got their own chip, and I think they also used a Qualcomm chip as well, with an ARM processor on it. But they didn't do a very good job of the emulator. And initially, they only put the 32-bit emulator in. So it only did x86-32-bit programs, not 64-bit programs, and I think just recently in the last month or so, Microsoft has released a 64-bit emulator for their Surface computers, but it's only just happened. So they're still behind the curve. The advantage, though, is that Apple is forcing the software industry to write native code for ARM, which will, with a very minor modification, work on Microsoft. So it's actually helping Microsoft. But one of the main reasons for this is Apple had already developed an emulator when they first went to Intel chips to convert from the PowerPC to the x86 computer. So the code was already there. They just had to make a few tweaks here and there to get that emulator to work with the ARM computer and go from x86 to ARM. They call it Rosetta 2. Rosetta 1 was the original emulator that they had on their Intel-based computers. So this is quite an important part of the whole story, and actually has worked extremely well. And the tests that I've seen is when you've got programs running that are native x84 programs through the emulator, it's hard to tell I haven't tried it myself, but some of the videos I've seen on YouTube, they've been unable to tell the difference in performance between the x86 and the M1, although the M1 was using an emulator. So that's the emulator. The other part of it, next one, is what I'll call virtualization. This is another important aspect of computers, especially for developers. And basically what it does, it makes the computer look like another computer operating system. So it could look like either a Linux operating system or a Windows operating system. Now, with the Apple Intel products, Oracle VirtualBox works extremely well. QEMU works very well. And there are two or three others, Fusion and their own parallels. They all work pretty well at virtualizing Linux or Microsoft computers. You can read the literature today, and it's still not there. Although Apple are working with VMware and Parallels to get the virtualization software up to snuff. And QEMU, which is actually an open source emulator written for Linux, is working after a fashion with the M1 chip. And I've read that some people are able to emulate Windows using the M1, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's open source yet. It's getting there.
So the beauty of the emulators, you can run Windows.
You can run
on
Windows
this computer.
on that computer, right? And you will see a picture down here in the bottom corner there. This virtualized Windows 10 for ARM on M1 with Alexander Graf's QMenu hypervisor patch. He's actually patched QEMU because, like I said, QEMU is an open source program. This particular guy has written a little patch for that program to make it work on the M1 with an M1 computer. And he's got Windows running, and you can see there's a Windows screen within his desktop, Windows 10 screen. You'll see his desktop up there underneath. You'll see his desktop where it says screenshot. The whole thing is his desktop, and then there's another little desktop within there with Windows 10 running on it. So it's almost ready. Next one.
You have to run the Windows 365.
Windows 365. Surprisingly, Microsoft has got Windows 65 native running on the M1 chip. So you could get Windows 365 for the M1 today. That's one running. Windows will work. See, although Windows and Apple work against one another, they also work with one another, because Windows basically is they're selling their Microsoft Office suite. And they want Microsoft Office, all Apple users. If this thing takes off and swamps the Windows market, they want their Microsoft Office suite to be on here. They want to be able to sell it. So they're working with them. And then on the flip side, as the software providers provide software to run on the M1, it's a very small step for it to run on Microsoft's ARM platform. And Microsoft are definitely working on an ARM platform. So what's next? Well, first of all, I haven't talked much about AMD. AMD are a very interesting company as well. They had a slightly different approach. They still use the core of they've used their own processors, but they're x86 based on the license from Intel. And they've gone the system on chip route with the SoC route, and they've added to their chip, and like the Haswell and the latest AMD chips are actually a system on chip using a kind of an Intel core, but their own bits around it. So they've kind of developed an Intel-based chip or an x86-based chip. But they're also working on replacing that Intel core with an ARM-based chip. I don't know too much about it. There's a link there. You can read a little bit if you're interested. So you'll see over the next 12 months, probably an AMD ARM-based SoC on the market, which will open up another world of computing. And then there's one final wrinkle in this whole thing, and that's what this NVIDIA ARM deal is going to do. It's because because NVIDIA is actually a big competitor to AMD in the graphics world. And also their business model is more like, I would say, Intel's than ARM's. So Apple and NVIDIA have not been in concert for a long while. They've been kind of fighting against one another because NVIDIA won't work 100% with Apple. They're kind of like Adobe. They're kind of on again, off again. So we don't know what that's going to do yet. But nevertheless, Apple's gone ahead and gone ahead with the M1 chip with the ARM-based processor. I don't know. I don't know why they didn't buy ARM, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Also, another very, very interesting side to this is the chip itself, the chip manufacturing. I haven't gone into this a lot, but basically the chips in all computers, and I'm saying all computers, all smartphones, all tablets, the chip itself is made by either a Taiwan company called TSMC or Samsung. And those two companies basically corner the world in terms of CPU manufacturing capability.
The second one is Taiwan also.
No, Samsung.
Korean.
Samsung, Korean. So
Oh,
So if you look at the world, Samsung and Korea, the way you measure these chips is how thin a film of silicon they can produce. The Intel, for example, I can't remember what they're down to now, but they're in the between 10 and 20 nanometers. Huh?
I think 9.
Are they into the nines now?
I think so.
I didn't think they were under 10. But anyway, they're in that kind of range of around 10 nanometers. So they're latest and greatest i9 whatever multi-core chip. The basic silicon layer has a thickness of 9 or 10 nanometers. TSMC are producing 5 nanometer chips. The M1 chip is based on 5 nanometer layer. And they're looking at 3 nanometers, or even I've seen 2 nanometers that they're able to produce. Now, the Chinese are working on this in parallel. And this gets kind of where this political game has gone over the last 12 months in terms of saying we're not going to buy Chinese chips. It's basically helped TSMC out of Taiwan and actually Samsung out of Korea. TSMC are also committed to, I think, building a facility in New Mexico, I think, to produce. I'm not sure how low they're going. I don't know they're going to 5 nanometers, certainly not going to 3, but maybe 5 nanometers. So there is a potential US capability to produce the chips that are required for these laptops and cell phones, particularly cell phones. So that's a little bit of history. And I've got a link here. You could go and check out that link at your leisure. And there's also some real, if you just go to YouTube and search for TSMC, there's some real good videos out there that'll give you guided tours of TSMC's factory, which is very, very interesting. So anyway, that's it, and that's where I'm going to stop today, I think. I don't think I've got anything else.
Yep, that's it.
So if there's any questions, I'll open it to questions. I'll try and answer them if I can. Any questions?
Just a couple of observations.
Yeah,
This thing runs without a fan.
it runs without a fan, yes.
It runs very cool, even with high stress
Yes,
applications. The thing about the die, the 3 nanometer, 5 nanometer die is you get many more transistors on a chip, and it runs so cool. It doesn't draw the power,
Right,
so it runs really cool. And if you're looking at data centers, that's a
Yeah.
big deal.
well, even
For
to,
air conditioning,
Right,
for power draw.
right. Even today, I mean, the big, the server market is wide open in terms of data centers. Right now, they all run on Linux, and a lot of them are running ARM computers, by the way. They're not down into the 5 nanometer, but if they do go down there, then you're right. I mean, the impact on air conditioning alone is going to be huge.
Can you give us an idea of what the cost of a computer with?
Oh, yeah, the cost. This thing, and he's got one right there, the base price on this is $999. It's under $1,000. They pitched it under $1,000. If you're able to get a discount, you can, if you're able to get a student discount or something like that, you can get $100 off. Now, the upgrade,
There are online sellers that are selling it cheaper too.
yeah.
$100 off.
Yeah, I think what they get the education discount or something like that, then resell
Apple
it.
offers the educational
Yeah.
discount, but like B&H Photo and
Yeah.
Adorama and some of these places, they're selling it at a discount.
You'll find that the one that I got and the one Mike's got has got an M1 with 7 cores,
Some of the graphic core.
7 graphic cores, and 8 gig of RAM. You can buy it with 8 cores and 16 gig of RAM for, I think, a couple $100 more,
I
something
think
like
it's
that.
$200.
Yeah, for a couple $100 more, which is $100 shy of the MacBook Pro. And the difference between this MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro is the MacBook Pro's got a fan. Now, the performance-wise, it's identical to the upgraded version of this. So you say, well, why do I want to spend another $100 on the MacBook Pro? Battery life, and if you're using it day to day, MacBook Pro gives you an amazing battery life.
2 more hours. 2 more
It
hours.
says 2 more hours, but I think it's more than that. It's 2 more hours if you're running it flat out. If you're running it as I am, I mean, it's just amazing.
How long do you get on that chart?
Well, I saw one test where they ran it for 84 hours.
How many?
84 hours.
hours?
They're saying 18 hours of like web browsing, that kind of stuff.
But
18 hours.
there's one test that I saw, I was telling him on YouTube, where they lined up a whole bunch of them, including this one, and a bunch of Intel Windows-based computers, and they all ran the same program continuously, over and over and over and over. I can't remember what it was. But the MacBook Air, this one, I think it ran out of steam after about, I don't know, 15 hours, say, something like that. And there was 1 or 2 of the others that ran out an hour or 2 later. But the MacBook Pro with the fan just kept on running and running and running and running. It went 84 hours without running out of battery. I mean, it's just,
So
What's
this-
that other company you said? BH Photo?
B&H Photo and
Yeah.
Adorama, ADORAMA. AMA. But this one, this base model has 256 gigs of disk space. It's a solid state drive,
Yeah.
8 gigs of RAM. You can upgrade to 16 gigs of RAM for another $200. The MacBook Pro starts at $300 more than this.
What's the brand of that?
This is a MacBook Air.
You can buy it direct from Apple for $9.99.
I don't even think you need 16 gigs of RAM.
I don't either. I'm using with 8 gigs of RAM. I'm gonna try it out with, I was telling him I've run Tomb Raider on here, which is heavily graphics oriented. It got a bit warm, but it was running at, I want to say 60 odd frames a second. I mean, it was running at pretty high frame rate, which is how you measure graphics. No problem.
How many inch machine is it?
This is a 13-inch.
Yeah, it's a 13.3 inch display. They call it a 13 inch
Yeah,
computer.
The real key is that solid state drive, I guess, as opposed to.
Yeah.
well, it has a,
It's fast too. The
it has a,
read-write
it has a
is
solid
really
state
fast.
drive in it, yes, yes.
If you're worried about running out of space, you can upgrade the drive. I think it's $200 to go to 512.
Are they doing a 512? Yeah,
You can get it up to 2 terabytes.
yes, I know, but I find at home I run a NAS. You know what a NAS is? You run a NAS, right?
Outside drive.
Basically, I all photos, videos, all that kind of heavy file size stuff. I don't have on here. I have it on my NAS.
Or you could just use a USB-C.
Or you use a
external
USB
drive.
stick or an external drive like this.
The bad thing about this thing is it's got two
Right.
USB-C ports.
It's actually one more than my MacBook Air had.
They're Thunderbolt 4 ports, and
Yeah.
it's got a headphone jack.
Yeah.
So if you want to have more ports, you got to buy a dock and just plug it in here.
But
But they're not too bad. You can get one for $65. It gives you.
You got one of these. This one's, it's got 4 USB ports and that's a USB-C output on there. So,
It's a fantastic machine.
yeah,
It's got a Retina screen display. It's really lovely.
I mean, the screen, I had for about 6 months, I had which one was it? I want to say it was a Hewlett Packard. I can't remember which one it was, but basically it was a Ryzen latest generation Ryzen computer. The problem I had with it was the screen. Unless you're prepared to pay $1,500, couple of $1,000, the screen on the cheap laptops is just terrible, terrible. I mean, you can't work with them. This screen is a Retina screen. This one on here is a Retina screen. It's far better, far better.
The one thing that this is lacking that I would love to have, and computers are starting to come out with it,
Uh-huh.
is the LTE chip. So you can
Yeah.
do cellular connection. You can only do Wi-Fi connections on this one, so you got to be near a Wi-Fi network. A lot of the computers are coming out with LTE chips, so you can do cellular connections. I believe Apple's going to come out with that soon.
Yeah,
Can you get them in larger screen?
Not right now.
not right now.
This one, the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro have this size screen, but there's rumors coming out that they're gonna have a 14-inch one in March.
Yeah, but you can fire it up. Can I take your, are we finished with the Zoom or not?
So we can kill it.
So you don't have a desktop